Some people gain belly fat during stressful periods, even when they are eating well and staying active. If that's ever happened to you, this video is for you. Have you ever noticed that during long periods of stress, your body seems to change even if your habits haven't changed much? You might be eating roughly the same, you might still be moving your body, and yet over time, fat seems to accumulate more around the abdomen. For many people, this is confusing, even discouraging. It's easy to assume something must be wrong with diet, discipline, or motivation. But today, I want to explore a different question. Could chronic stress itself influence where fat is stored in the body? In this video, we'll look at what scientific research actually shows about stress, hormones, and belly fat, and why this pattern makes sense biologically. To understand this properly, we first need a small clarification. When scientists talk about belly fat, they are often referring to what's called central fat, that is, fat stored around the abdomen. This includes subcutaneous fat, which lies just under the skin and is the fat you can feel from the outside, and visceral fat, which is stored deeper inside the abdomen around the internal organs. Why does this distinction matter? Because visceral fat is more metabolically active. It's more strongly linked to insulin resistance, inflammation, cardiovascular disease, and type 2 diabetes. That's why researchers are often more interested in fat distribution, not just body weight or BMI. Let's look at what we see in real people, not just theory. One strong example comes from a large US study called the Multi Ethnic Study of Atherosclerosis, where Delker and colleagues followed 1,809 adults with an average age of about 65 from multiple ethnic backgrounds. To assess chronic stress, participants were asked whether they had ongoing stress in major life areas such as health problems, job difficulties, financial strain, or relationship stress. Importantly, it only counted if the stress was moderate to severe and lasted 6 months or longer. Abdominal fat was then measured at a later follow up using CT scans, allowing researchers to directly assess both subcutaneous and visceral fat stored in the abdomen, something body weight or BMI can't capture. The typical follow up was around 3 years. And what did they find? People reporting higher chronic stress tended to carry more fat around the abdomen, including both subcutaneous and visceral fat, even after accounting for age, lifestyle, and mental health. When overall body weight measured by BMI was taken into account, the relationship became weaker but did not disappear, suggesting that stress relates to abdominal fat in ways not fully explained by weight alone. Importantly, stress was linked to greater abdominal fat overall without clearly favoring one fat type over the other. So, the key takeaway is simple. Chronic stress relates to where fat is stored, not just how much there is. So far, we have seen that chronic stress can line up with more abdominal fat in a large population study. But an important question remains: why do some people seem much more affected by stress than others? To explore that, Vander Valk and colleagues reviewed a large body of evidence on stress, cortisol, and obesity published in Current Obesity Reports. This paper brings in a key idea. Stress doesn't just matter, how your body responds to stress matters. The review focuses on cortisol, the body's main stress hormone, which is released when the brain perceives stress, whether that stress is physical, emotional, or psychological. In the short term, cortisol is helpful. It supports survival, helps us cope with challenges by mobilizing energy and keeping us alert. But when stress becomes chronic, cortisol exposure stays high for long periods and it can encourage fat to accumulate around the abdomen. It can increase appetite, especially for energy dense foods. This pattern is well known from medical conditions where cortisol is chronically elevated, such as Cushing's syndrome, where people develop pronounced abdominal fat even without overeating. One important detail from this research is that cortisol can be measured over the long term even using hair samples. Hair cortisol reflects stress hormone exposure over weeks to months, not just a single stressful moment. Studies using this approach show that higher long term cortisol levels are linked to greater abdominal fat. Here's one of the most important insights from this review. Cortisol is the signal, but the body's response to that signal can differ dramatically from person to person. And why is that? Because cortisol doesn't act on its own. Its effects depend on how strongly different tissues respond to it. Cortisol works by binding to receptors inside our cells. These are called glucocorticoid receptors, and they determine how strongly tissues respond to stress signals. In simple terms, these receptors act like receivers. Cortisol sends the signal, but the receptor controls how loud that signal is inside the body. Some people appear more biologically sensitive to cortisol because of differences in how responsive these receptors are, which are partly genetic. It could also be due to differences in how long cortisol remains active within tissues, or it could be due to long term factors like poor sleep, chronic pain, or repeated stress exposure. So, what this means is important. Two people can have the same amount of cortisol circulating in their bodies, but their bodies may respond very differently because of glucocorticoid receptors. These receptors control how strongly cells respond to cortisol, and in some people, these receptors are just more sensitive. So, the same cortisol signal can have a much bigger effect inside the body, not because there's more stress, but because the signal is amplified. And that amplification can shape how energy is handled and where fat is stored, even under similar stress exposure. One more idea from this review is especially important. Stress and abdominal fat don't just move in one direction, they can reinforce each other. Chronic stress can increase cortisol activity, which promotes fat storage around the abdomen. But abdominal fat itself can act as a stress amplifier. People with more central fat often experience poorer sleep, more inflammation, physical discomfort, and social stress or weight stigma. All of these can further activate the stress system and keep cortisol signals elevated. So, over time, a feedback loop can form. Stress feeds abdominal fat, and abdominal fat feeds stress. This helps explain why stress related belly fat can be so persistent even when people are trying to eat well and stay active. So far, we have talked about stress signals, cortisol, receptors, and sensitivity. But there's one more layer to this story that scientists are increasingly interested in. What if stress doesn't just change hormones but also changes how fat tissue itself behaves? A detailed review published in BMC Physiology by Speaker and Fleshner explored this question by looking at inflammatory signals inside fat tissue, especially a molecule called interleukin 1 beta or IL-1 beta. IL-1 beta is an immune signaling molecule. It's part of the body's normal response to stress and injury. In the short term, it can be adaptive, helping mobilize energy during acute stress. What this review highlights, however, is something subtle but important. Stress does not increase inflammation evenly across all fat tissue. In animal studies, acute stress increased IL-1 beta mainly in subcutaneous fat, not visceral fat. When stress is repeated over and over, the authors propose that this inflammatory signal may stop being helpful. So, over time, repeated IL-1 beta signaling in subcutaneous fat may impair its normal functions, such as taking up circulating energy, storing fat efficiently, and expanding in a healthy way. When subcutaneous fat becomes less effective at doing its job, excess energy may be redirected towards visceral fat for storage instead. Crucially, this process can occur without major changes in body weight, so visceral fat can increase even when the scale doesn't move much. So, what these studies suggest is that stress is more likely to influence fat distribution in bodies that are biologically more sensitive to stress signals through cortisol, its receptors, and inflammatory responses inside fat tissue. For some people, the same level of stress produces a much stronger biological response. That insight shifts the conversation away from blame, away from trying harder, and toward understanding individual vulnerability. This helps explain why some people notice abdominal fat increasing during stressful periods, even when diet and activity haven't changed much, and why focusing on only food or exercise doesn't always resolve the issue. For certain bodies, stress regulation isn't a side issue, It's part of the core physiology shaping how energy is handled and where fat ends up. Regulation matters as much as intensity, not just how hard we push, but how well the body recovers, adapts, and feels safe over time. So, addressing stress isn't a detour from health. For many people, it's a central part of it. Sometimes the body isn't asking for more discipline, it's asking for regulation.